Hello and welcome back to Tactics Board. It doesn't feel long since Norwich City's last championship game. They beat QPR 1-0 just 2 days ago, but we're already looking forward to another championship game against Watford at Vicarage Road. So I'm going to give you my predicted 11 for the game and my ideas on how I think it will pan out tactically. So without further ado, these are the players I think David Wagner will trust at Vicarage Road in the starting 11. So I've gone for George Long in goal, Jack Stacey at right back, Shane Duffy and Danny Bart at centre back, Dimitris Yunus at left back, Gabriel Sara and Kenny McLean in the centre of midfield, with Christian Fasnacht on the right, Marcelino Nunez behind Yujo Huang up front, and Ono Hernandez on the left. I've gone with Long at the back purely for fitness reasons. Of course, I spoke to David Wagner before the QPR game and he said it was probably still another week on Angus Gunn, so he's looking pretty unlikely to feature in this one, having not even trained going into it. Obviously, we're off to speak to Wagner again in a very short while, so we may find out more, but just based on the current timeline, I think Long's more likely to be in there ahead of Gunn purely on a fitness basis, although he did get his first clean sheet with the club on Saturday, so hopefully that will be a confidence booster and he can take that into the game against the Hornets. At right back, I've gone with Jack Stacey, who I think was impressive against QPR, and I think it may have been a wake-up call, actually. That was something I asked Wagner about. Obviously, he was dropped twice for Kellen Fisher at Sunderland and at Cardiff, but he came on at half-time in that Cardiff game when Norwich were struggling, and the introduction of him and Yunus, who was also dropped for Przemysław Porheta, really turned the game on its head, and I think Stacey continued that theme against QPR. He wasn't really helped out by his teammates at times. I don't think Christian Fasnacht had the best game on that right side with him, and probably the age profile of the team was a big part in why we saw Stacey and Yunus driving forwards up the wings and then quite consistently turning around and having to wait for everyone to catch up. Even Ono Hernandez at quite a lot of times ended up behind Dimitris Yunus, having been praised for sort of his pace and directness. I thought he struggled with that a little bit at times as well. So I felt for Stacey at times on Saturday, but not really much more he could have done in that one. For me, at centre-back, I've gone with Duffy and Bart, who obviously were key in that clean sheet, and it was their first game together against QPR. Looks like the sort of defence that Wagner likes, to be honest. I know it's probably not the most popular one amongst the fan base, not loads of pace in there, and I don't expect to see them play quite as much of a high line, although at times, obviously, Wagner's tactics are quite difficult to predict. But yeah, I obviously see them keeping their place for this one. They've got that experience that he loves so much, an average age of 32 between them, and only really Jayden Warner at the moment contesting it. Obviously, Grant Hanley's introduction from injury will provide a new dynamic in a couple of weeks and perhaps provide some competition in that position, but for now those two are probably quite secure, especially when you consider Wagner's principles. They're very much kick it, head it, clear it, and sometimes that does benefit you. Probably worth mentioning that in this game I very much expect the same sort of tactical setup and performance that we saw against QPR. It was very much a sort of away performance, even though it was at Carrow Road and against a Watford team who are in good form at their ground just 3 days after another game. Having that game itself come after an international break, I think it would be no surprise to see Wagner set up in that same way. That certainly seemed to be how he was hinting in the post-match press conference, and yeah, I think Bart and Duffy suit that really well, so I'd expect to see them. A centre-back. At left-back, I've gone with Yunus. I spoke a little bit about the impact that him and Stacey had at Cardiff and how well they played on Saturday, and I thought Yunus was pretty much as good as Stacey. I've always said it, but technically one of Norwich City's best players. Defensively, he has struggled at times, but I do think in a similar way to Stacey, a couple of times he's been dropped this year and in the last couple of months have woken him up a little bit for me, and I think the last couple of performances we've seen from him have been him back at his best, so I expect to see him at left back. Jumping up to the midfield, Gabriel Sara was a more defensive presence against QPR than I think a lot expected. There has been criticism of him. I've spoken myself about how I think he needs to up his levels to to produce the same impact that he did early on in the season, but his defensive statistics actually were really good. I've included a section in my 6 things from the QPR game that you can read now at Pinkin.com about that defensive contribution and how impressive those stats were. A little bit of a surprise for me after a difficult few weeks for Sarah. Obviously also contributes to that assist and another fine performance. So while the likes of Stacey and Yanulis maybe did need that wake-up call, it looks like the international break has provided Sarah with an opportunity to take stock and get back to his best, because I think he was close to that level against QPR. Alongside him, Kenny McLean, obviously one of the first names on the team sheet, and I thought quietly impressive again against QPR in a season where not a lot of people in yellow and green are coming out in credit. I think a lot of people are recognising his contribution. So although I feel for him, having been perhaps the only stalwart of a really struggling team, I think he has impressed in the last few years and has committed quite a lot to this club with that new contract, and I think he deserves the plaudits, and that's why he's one of the first names on the team sheet. On the right, I've gone for Fastnacht, who I've already said I don't think was especially impressive against QPR. Much like the rest of that attacking quartet, wasn't really very involved in that game, didn't do much from an attacking perspective, some hard work off the ball and some defensive contribution, but not much other than that. However, that seems to be the direction that Wagner is going in at the moment. He seems to be focused on that defensive contribution and the sort of hard work. He's also obviously a favourite of Wagner, who was a massive part in bringing him to the football club in the first place. The only first team player Norwich spent money on this summer in the form of a transfer fee. So that tells you how highly Wagner rates him. We know he's a favourite, and after a win, I don't see him being dropped. On the left, I've gone for Onel Hernandez, and it's the same, really, just a favourite of Wagner's who wasn't that impressive against QPR, but is difficult to drop after a win. Wagner doesn't really like to make too many changes either, and he doesn't seem to fancy Borja Sainz too much, who, in fairness, I don't think was especially good when he came on against QPR. I know he's been cast by a lot in this role of sort of saviour, and the goal on debut against Fulham didn't really help with the pressure on that front, but he hasn't contributed too much in any of his substitute appearances. Perhaps he's somebody who needs a good amount of time on the pitch, and I would like to see him given that, but I don't think he will be, to be honest, at Watford, because, as I said, Hernandez is more Wagner's sort of player and was involved in a win against QPR, so I expect to see him out there. The only change I've gone for is Marcelino Nunez over Ashley Barnes, and although I think Wagner would love to keep Barnes in there, he did play 90 minutes, obviously wasn't substituted in that QPR game, having spent 2 months on the sidelines with a knee ligament injury. So it would make sense for him to drop out. Not only that, but Wagner said going into the QPR game he wouldn't start all 3 of this week's games against QPR in this Watford one and then against Bristol on Sunday, and it would make sense, if you want to give him a bit of a rest, not to start him in this one. I would be very surprised if he doesn't play a role, at least as a substitute, but it would seem strange to start him in this one, start him against QPR, and then drop him for the Bristol game in 5 days' time when he's had a little bit of time to rest. So I've gone with Nunez in there. Admittedly, not really the type of profile I think Wagner would ideally have in there for a more defensive game plan, but he has spoken about Adamida as a sort of super sub, and that seems to be the way that he views him now. So if that is the way it is, and he doesn't want to go with 2 sort of traditional strikers up front, Nunez is his only real option as a sort of number 10 at the moment. Obviously, Adam Forshaw, Jakob Sorensen also out injured, so there's not the opportunity to push Gabriel Sara forward or go with the 3 in midfield. So I've gone with Nunez in that sort of number 10 position, and then Hwang up front, who I think is becoming a sort of Wagner favourite. He's defended him a number of times, not just to do with the off-the-pitch issues, but also on the pitch. I think he's faced a lot of criticism, and although I don't personally feel that he suits Wagner's system very well, of course he scored a very good goal in that QPR game. He did touch the ball less than any other player who started it, but that probably tells you a bit about the life of a striker. Just spent a lot of time floating on the edges and then produced that moment of quality. So especially in the sort of game plan I expect to see Wagner employ, maybe that's the sort of striker you want, the one that's going to take the only chance you create all game. That was the game plan against QPR, and that did pay off with Hwang up front, so maybe we see the same thing from him. That's my predicted 11 for the game. We'll obviously have every kick covered at Vicarage Road. There's also the press conference to come on this YouTube channel very soon. So keep it locked to all of our channels. Go to pinkham.com/subscribe and you can get the first 2 months for £1.99 and only £2.99 thereafter. As I always say, fantastic value if you ask me. So give that a try. Let me know what you think. Thank you for joining me on here and I'll see you on Tactics Board again very soon.